Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald back with a new episode of System Update exclusively on Rumble. And I regard this, I guess, as a special edition of System Update. And I say that because this is going to be a little bit longer than the normal video, which I think is really worthwhile because there was a major development today in a story that I consider to be of the greatest significance, one of the most underreported, under-discussed stories. In fact, one of the stories that the corporate media has most lied about in the last several years. And when you take a bird's eye view of it, take a step back and look at exactly what happened, especially in light of the new developments, it's really extraordinary the level of lying and deceit and manipulation on the part of a union of the corporate media, big tech, the Democratic Party, and the intelligence community to manipulate the 2020 election, in particular, by first lying about and then overtly censoring from the internet any discussion of a major story that was broken by the New York Post weeks before the election, taken from documents, authentic documents found on the laptop of Joe Biden's son Hunter that raised serious questions about Joe Biden. That story was brute censored from the internet by Twitter and Facebook and was essentially buried and lied about by the corporate media using the CIA as the lie, as the excuse to lie. And we now have even more definitive proof than we ever had before about what a grave assault this was on our democracy and what an extreme example of journalistic corruption is what it was as well. And I just want to walk you through it. And I think it's really worth it to spend the time to remember what happened here and to look at what happened, especially in light of this new evidence. Now, just to remind you of the broad outlines of the story, on October 14th of 2020, just 3 weeks or so before the United States was scheduled to vote in the 2020 presidential election, the New York Post, the nation's oldest newspaper, broke a major story, the headline of which was "Smoking Gun Email Reveals How Hunter Biden Introduced Ukrainian Businessman to His Vice Presidential Dad." And the New York Post explains that they had gotten their hands on a gigantic archive that came from a laptop of Hunter Biden's and could authenticate the documents in numerous ways. And these documents, reported first by the New York Post on October 14th, detailed how Joe Biden used and abused his power as vice president with the responsibility for Ukraine in his portfolio to benefit a company, Burisma Energy, that was paying his son Hunter $50,000 a month for Hunter to sit on the board of, even though Hunter had no experience whatsoever in this industry. His only qualification was he had access to his dad, who was the vice president, who had significant power over Ukraine. And the emails that the New York Post published revealed that Joe Biden was meeting with Burisma executives, that Hunter was promising them that he would do favors for them. That was the first story. The second story, which in my view was even more significant, came the next day on October 15th, the headline of which emails reveal how Hunter Biden tried to cash in big on behalf of family with Chinese firm. And it detailed how Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's brother, Jim Biden, were pursuing business deals in China that very likely included a profit participation by Joe Biden, who obviously at the time, after being vice president, was a likely presidential frontrunner and therefore could use his influence to benefit all sorts of Chinese interest. And one of the most incriminating and important documents published by the New York Post as part of this story was this email that set out the deal terms that included a phrase that said, quote, 10 held by H for the big guy. And there was testimony the New York Post had that the big guy meant Joe Biden. So this was a deal being pursued in China where Joe Biden would actually get 10% of the participation, raising serious questions about the presidential frontrunner 3 weeks before the election. Now, when you get a big archive like this, it's important to authenticate it, because if someone hands you a huge archive of documents, as a journalist, you first need to make sure that what you've been given is accurate and true. And there are a lot of ways to do that. I have a lot of experience working on archives like these. I've covered WikiLeaks for many years and worked with WikiLeaks on their huge archives. I reported in 2013 on the massive archive, in fact, the biggest leak in the history of U.S. journalism, when Edward Snowden gave me an archive of many, many top secret NSA documents. And in 2019, I was given a very explosive archive by a secret source in Brazil to report on corruption at the highest levels of the Brazilian government. And each time the question is, how do you authenticate documents like that, an archive like that, to make sure it's genuine? And there are ways to do it. One of the most important of which is to, if there are emails in the archive, as there was in those cases and in this one, you go to the people who were recipients of those emails or who participated in the email chain, and you confirm with them that the emails in the archive are identical to the ones that they actually got. There's a lot of different ways to authenticate it using computer specialists, and all of that was done very early on. There was enormous evidence that this archive and the emails in it that the New York Post was reporting on about Joe Biden were completely authentic. You can just look at a couple of examples. Here is from Fox News on October 22nd, so a week after the New York Post began its reporting, which reported, quote, Hunter Biden's business partner calls emails genuine and says Hunter sought dad's advice on the deal. So they went and interviewed somebody who was a participant in these email chains in the creation of these documents, and that person said, yes, these documents were the ones that I got in real time and authenticated that they were real. As compelling of evidence as you can hope for as a journalist trying to authenticate an archive like this. Other confirmation came from outlets like the Daily Caller, which on October 29th, about a week later, used a forensic analyst to conclude that especially the most important emails, including the one about Joe Biden's activities in China, were authentic. And probably the most compelling evidence came from the oral testimony of Hunter Biden's business partner, who was Tony Boublinski, and he gave a speech and interviews in which he made clear that these documents were authentic, both comparing them to the ones he had in his possession and also to his memory of what took place. Listen to him in his own words a week after the New York Post began its reporting.
On May 13, 2017, I received an email concerning allocation of equity, which says 10% held by H for the big guy. In that email, there's no question that H stands for Hunter, big guy for his father, Joe Biden, and Jim for Jim Biden. In fact, Hunter often referred to his father as the big guy or my chairman. On numerous occasions, it was made clear to me that Joe Biden's involvement was not to be mentioned in writing, but only face-to-face. In fact, I was advised by Gilliard and Walker that Hunter and Jim Biden were paranoid about keeping Joe Biden's involvement secret.
Now, this was not a Republican operative. This was Hunter Biden's own business partner. So you had this mountain of evidence. The problem was that it was all compiled by the only outlets interested in investigating this story, which were conservative outlets like the Daily Caller, Fox News. And so it got ignored almost entirely by the liberal wing of the corporate media that was desperate to elect Joe Biden and bury any stories like these that might have been harmful to his chances to win. In other words, they were acting as campaign operatives and not as journalists, had no interest in investigating this. They pretended this evidence of authenticity didn't exist. And in its place, what they used was an outright lie from the CIA, from ex-CIA officials like John Brennan and others who had spent years propagating frauds in Russiagate and feeding it to the media outlet. And instead of investigating, instead of reporting on the contents of the story, they just repeated this FBI lie over and over as an excuse to censor the story and to get people to ignore it. And to this very day, they maintain this lie was true. Now, unsurprisingly, one of the first people to report on this lie from the CIA was Natasha Bertrand, who is responsible for many of the worst Russiagate frauds, and she was repeatedly rewarded for it by getting promoted to The Atlantic, and she's now at CNN, and she published this story on October 19th, just days after the New York Post story was first published, the headline of which was Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinformation. Dozens of former intel officials say. And it cited a letter from, as it says, dozens of former intel officials like John Brennan and the whole group that was agitating against Trump for 5 years, that this article claimed was them saying to ignore the Hunter Biden archive of documents because it was two things. Number one, Russian, it came from Russia. And number two, it was disinformation, meaning the documents were fake, They weren't authentic, despite that mountain of evidence. Now, what's amazing about this storyline that Natasha Bertrand and Politico and others propagated by just simply mimicking uncritically what these intelligence officials said, was that if you actually looked at the letter that they reported that the intelligence officials signed, it didn't actually say what this headline says, that the Hunter Biden story is Russian disinformation. They were much slimier about it, but actually more honest than even these journalists. Let's take a look at the key paragraph of this letter that they all use. Here it is, the letter from former intelligence officials on October 19th that became the excuse to censor the story. And what it says, and you can read it right up there, is we want to emphasize that we do not know if the emails provided to the New York Post are genuine or not. And we do not have evidence of Russian involvement, just that our experience makes us deeply suspicious that the Russian government played a significant role in this case. So they admitted from the start that they had no evidence. So on the one hand, you have no evidence by their own admission that the Russian government was involved or this was disinformation, versus a mountain of evidence that it was actually authentic. And yet the corporate media was so desperate to bury the truth about Joe Biden and make sure that nothing endangered what they were eager to have be his victory 3 weeks from then, that this letter from known liars in the CIA gave them the excuse to perpetrate a massive fraud on you and on the American public. Let's look at what they did. First of all, Facebook went on October 14th and through a lifelong Democratic Party operative named Andy Stone, who now works as the communications officer for Facebook, went onto Twitter and he spoke about the story with contempt. He said, while I will intentionally not link to the New York Post, I want to be clear that this story is eligible to be fact-checked by Facebook's third-party fact-checking partners. In the meantime, we are reducing the distribution on our platform, meaning they're tinkering with the algorithms to prevent you from discussing and sending and disseminating the New York Times revelations, pending what they claimed was a fact check. Now, who is this Andy Stone that made this announcement on behalf of Facebook that they would be censoring our political discourse and the dissemination of reporting from the New York Post in the weeks leading up to the election? You can see his Twitter bio. He says right now he works at communications for Facebook, but he's an alum of the House Majority PAC, which is the Democratic Party's political action committee to ensure they always maintain a majority in the House of Representatives. Before that, he worked for Senator Barbara Boxer, the liberal Democrat from California. Prior to that, he worked for the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee that also ensures that Democrats have a majority in the House. And before that, he worked for a run-of-the-mill Republican congressman from California, Democratic congressman from California. He spent his whole life in servitude to the Democratic Party. And that's who announced on behalf of Facebook that they were going to be algorithmically suppressing the story on the grounds that they couldn't trust it, even though there was enormous evidence proving that it was authentic, reliable, and true. Now, Twitter went much further than even Facebook did. Twitter didn't just algorithmically suppress the story, they outright banned it. You were not allowed to post links to the reporting or otherwise discuss it. It's an extraordinary thing that Twitter did to prohibit its users from even mentioning this reporting or making people aware of it. Here's an article from The Guardian on October 15th, the day after both Twitter and Facebook decided to censor the story. The headline of it was, Facebook and Twitter restrict controversial New York Post story on Joe Biden. Social media platforms moved to limit the spread of an article amid questions about its veracity. Nobody had questions about its veracity except for the CIA, which claimed that it was disinformation, and that gave everyone the green light to do it. Now, the Guardian article goes on to describe what happened. And let's think about how extraordinary this is, that in the weeks before the election, this is what these big tech platforms did. Quote, Facebook and Twitter took steps on Wednesday to limit the spread of a controversial New York Post article critical of Joe Biden, sparking outrage among conservatives and stoking debate over how social media platforms should tackle misinformation ahead of the U.S. election. Who said this story was misinformation. It was not misinformation. It was completely authentic. But this is how they immediately deceptively labeled it to justify censoring it. And The Guardian frames it as it's a debate over how Twitter and Facebook should tackle misinformation, when in fact it was them censoring true and authentic reporting about the Democratic frontrunner. The Guardian article goes on to say, in an unprecedented step against a major news publication, Twitter blocked users from posting links to the Post story or photos from the unconfirmed report. Users attempting to share the story were shown a notice saying, "We can't complete this request because this link has been identified by Twitter or our partners as being potentially harmful." Harmful. Any attempt to discuss the New York Post reporting about Joe Biden's activity in Ukraine and China, potentially harmful. It was harmful to the Democratic Party, not to anyone else. Users clicking or retweeting a link already posted to Twitter are shown a warning that the link, quote, the link may be unsafe. It goes on, quote, Facebook, meanwhile, placed restrictions on linking to the article, saying there were questions about its validity. They quote Andy Stone, the Facebook spokesman, who in reality was the lifelong Democratic Party operative, quote, saying, quote, "This is part of our standard process to reduce the spread of misinformation." Now, he had no idea as well that this was misinformation and ignored all of the evidence I showed you right away, proving it was almost certainly true. The article goes on. The move marks the first time Twitter has directly limited the spread of information from a news website. The first time, 3 weeks before America goes to vote for president, Twitter, for the first time, directly limited the spread of information as it continues to implement stricter rules around misinformation ahead of the 2020 election. Now, let's look at a couple of examples of what you saw if you tried to talk about or link to the New York Post reporting about Joe Biden. Here is a reporter from Politico on October 14th, the day the New York Post first published the story, and he said, wow, Twitter going even further than Facebook and is no longer letting people tweet the New York Post story. This is what pops up if you try, and I remember very well seeing this myself, if you try to post a link, not just publicly, but even in direct messages, chatting with people, tweet not sent. Your tweet couldn't be sent because this link has been identified by Twitter or our partners as being potentially harmful. The next day, an actual editor of the New York Post, Sabra Mamari, went on to Twitter and said, Twitter is censoring us again. This was the China story, now not just the Ukraine story. And he wrote, "This is what an editor at America's oldest continuously published newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton, get when I try to post our follow-up story on Hunter Biden's financial shenanigans with the Chinese regime." He couldn't even post the reporting from his paper's own story on Twitter. It's the kind of message you get in China or Iran or places we're told are the big, bad, repressive countries that censor. That's exactly what happened both on Twitter and Facebook in the weeks leading before the election in order to protect Joe Biden. I can't overstate how chilling this should be, even if it were misinformation, possibly, let alone the fact that it was so clearly true. Now, Twitter didn't just ban reporting of the story. They also locked the New York Post out of their own account for 2 weeks. So you have an oppositional party, a right-leaning party, doing reporting on Joe Biden, and Twitter just blocked them from even using their Twitter account. Here's a Variety article on October 17th. Twitter still blocking a New York Post story based on alleged Hunter Biden emails. Newspaper's account remains frozen. Now, why did I go and decide to examine these series of events today? In part because I really don't think we've fully processed how pernicious this was, how insidious this was. And I think we could really benefit from a deep dive, like I'm doing, into the events that happened so we can look at it from start to finish. But the real impetus is that there's a new book out today from a young reporter at Politico, Ben Schreckinger. And the title of the book is The Bidens. Here you see the cover. I got my hands on this book several days ago. I had been reading it. I knew that this book did what I'm about to show you, which is confirms dispositively and definitively that the key emails on which the New York Post reporting was based were authentic, and that the claims that it was disinformation or Russian disinformation was an absolute lie. He went and spent months doing the reporting that proves that these emails were authentic. Let's just take a look at a couple of the key passages in his book. And remember, this is not a right-wing journalist with a right-wing outlet. This is one with a very mainstream media outlet, Politico, which ironically was the first outlet to spread the CIA's lie through Natasha Bertrand that you should ignore the Hunter Biden laptop reporting because it's, quote, Russian disinformation. This is the same outlet, Politico, whose reporter is now saying, you know what, that story, he's saying it implicitly, that shaped so much of what happened was an absolute lie. The reality is these documents were genuine and my reporting proved it. Here's what he said in his book. First of all, here's a news item from Politico promoting the book. And it says, Ben Schreckinger's The Bidens, Inside the First Family's 50-Year Rise to Power, out today, finds evidence that some of the purported Hunter Biden laptop material is genuine, including 2 emails at the center of last October's controversy. So he didn't go and authenticate every last one, including ones that were banal or about Hunter Biden's personal life, none of which matter. He authenticated the key ones about Joe Biden in Ukraine, Joe Biden in China, the ones that actually mattered that people tried to do the reporting of. Here's from his book, the actual book, the text from his book, and he describes how he authenticated it. Quote, a person who corresponded with Hunter in late 2018 confirmed to me the authenticity of an email in the cache. Another person who corresponded with Hunter in January 2019 confirmed the authenticity of a different email exchange with Hunter. Both of these people spoke on this condition of anonymity, citing fears of being embroiled in a global controversy. Now, that's exactly how I authenticated the Snowden the archive and the Brazil archive. I found people who had received some of those documents, and they told me that the documents in the archive are the same ones as that they got. That's exactly what this reporter from Politico did. But he did more than that as well. He went on. A third person who had independent access to Hunter's emails confirmed to me that the emails published by the New York Post related to Burisma and the CEFC venture matched the substance of emails Hunter had in fact received. The person was not in a position to compare the published emails word for word to the originals, but he did remember that the key emails about what Biden did in Ukraine, about what Hunter and Jim Biden did in China, matched the substance of the emails that Hunter had in fact received, comparing them to what the New York Post published and saying, yes, those are accurate. There's still more proof. He goes on, quote, Hunter has not publicly disputed the authenticity of any of the communications from the Post stories. He told CBS News the laptop, quote, certainly could be his in an interview filmed several months after the election. The National Property Board of Sweden, part of the Swedish Finance Ministry, has released correspondence between Hunter and House of Sweden employees to me and the Swedish newspaper under the country's Freedom of Information law. Emails released by the property board match emails in the cache. So over and over, he's authenticating these emails exactly the way that you would want to if you were actually a journalist seeking to determine whether they were authentic. Again, there was enormous amounts of exactly the same kind of confirmation early on, but they were ignored because they came from right-wing outlets. But now we have a mainstream reporter proving dispositively that the key emails were authentic all along. They were never disinformation or forgeries. Now, I cannot overstate to you how deliberately and relentlessly the corporate media lied and deceived and schemed in order to keep this story from reaching the American public. This is a very close election. 60,000 votes in a couple of swing states could have easily swung the election from Joe Biden to Donald Trump. Who knows how many people were denied hearing about this reporting as a result of the outright lies told by the CIA and the corporate media. But let's just review some of what they did to justify suppression of the story. And let me just say before I show you that I've been reporting for 15 years. I've been reporting on a lot of very serious matters and conflicts. I've seen a lot of things. I'm generally very even-keeled about the reporting that I do. I don't typically get emotional. But in the course of going back in light of this new evidence and gathering everything the media was saying, the people who claim that they're combating misinformation all the time and disinformation and wanting to censor the internet in the name of keeping you safe from disinformation, to watch how they lied and deceived and abdicated their journalistic responsibility so flagrantly actually left me indignant and even enraged. I've been angry about it all day doing this research with my team to put together this report about what they did because it's so glaring. Now, the real challenge here was picking which examples to show you because it was basically every single day all over the entire corporate media, the lies and deceit and propaganda. So it was very hard to pick out the ones that should be highlighted because there's so many similar ones as egregious that I won't be able to show you, or else this video would be 10 hours long. But let me show you a few illustrative ones. So first of all, here is on October 22nd from NPR's managing editor, whose name is Terrence Samuels. And he was asked about why NPR wasn't covering the revelations from the New York Post. This is what he said, quote, "We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories. And we don't want to waste the listener and reader's time on stories that are just pure distraction. We don't want to waste our time on stories that aren't stories." How does NPR justify even saying that? But let me show you something much worse. This is Christiane Amanpour on CNN. And she's speaking to Liz Harrington, who is an official at the Republican National Committee at the time. And she's trying to get Christiane to talk about the Biden laptop and the things it reveals about the Democratic Party frontrunner. And listen to Christiane Amanpour refuse to even allow a discussion of it. And listen to what she says about why that is.
Okay, you know what also the United States government says? The FBI says this laptop is not Russian disinformation. So what are you talking about here? This laptop is real. It's not just the laptop. There's other emails. There's text messages. They are real. So according to the U.S. government, the FBI has verified this.
Everybody to look at that, but that's not what we're hearing from the FBI.
Why don't you want to report this? This is one of the most powerful families in Washington, the Biden family. And you're okay? You're okay with our interests being sold out to profit? Joe Biden and his family, when we're suffering during a pandemic from communist China, he's doing shady business deals with communist China. You're comfortable, okay?
As you know perfectly well, I'm a journalist and a reporter, and I follow the facts. And there has never been any issues in terms of corruption. Now, let me ask you this. Yesterday, the FBI...
Wait. How do you know that?
I'm talking about reporting and any evidence. I'm talking to you now.
Okay, I would love if you guys would start doing that digging and start doing that verification.
No, we're not going to do your work for you. I want to ask you a question. The FBI,
it's a journalist's job. It's a journalist's job to find out if this is verified.
I want to ask you a question about the FBI press conference.
I don't even have words for how repulsive that is. Christiane Amanpour says 4 times, "I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter," and then proceeds to abdicate every last duty of what a reporter is supposed to do. She actually says it's not our job to find out whether this information is or isn't accurate. This information that raises serious ethical questions about the person who is likely to be the president in a couple of months, according to the poll. She has no interest in that. In fact, she's saying, I'm not even going to let you talk about it. I'm not going to let you shift attention to this thing that is completely meaningless, and it's not my job to verify it because the FBI has told me, the FBI, to ignore it, that it's not actually true. It's an astonishing clip, but it's completely commonplace. Here, for example, is an outtake from former President Trump talking to Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes, where he's trying to get her to talk about the revelations that came from these documents. And listen to how Leslie Stahl justifies telling him she refuses to even talk about it.
I think it's one of the biggest scandals I've ever seen, and you don't cover it. You want to talk about...
Well, because it can't be verified.
You want to talk about insignificant things.
I'm telling you.
Of course it can be verified. Excuse me, they found the laptop. Leslie.
It can't be verified.
What can't be verified?
The laptop.
Why do you say that?
Because
even the family hasn't... The family on the laptop, he's gone into hiding. For 5 days, he's gone into hiding.
He's preparing for your debate.
Oh, it's taken him 5 days to prepare? I doubt it. Okay, go ahead.
It's almost impossible to explain whether these people are more dishonest or more stupid. Did you hear what she said? The laptop can't be verified. At the time she said that, there was overwhelming evidence that the laptop and the documents on it were authentic. I showed it to you. I wanted to report on it. I was ready to write about it. I was prevented by my own outlet, The Intercept, from doing so and quit in protest, which we'll get to. But I was willing to put my name on this story because I know from my very significant experience working on archives like this, that the verification was there. She just either had no idea what that even means to do reporting on an archive and how to verify it, or she was just lying to help Joe Biden. Here's the thing, though, that I think is the worst thing I've seen. It was the report from Wolf Blitzer on CNN on October 16th, 2020. Listen to him tell CNN readers what he thinks they ought to know about this reporting from the New York Post.
Serious questions tonight about whether the Russians are using Rudy Giuliani to interfere in the U.S. presidential election. CNN senior national security correspondent Alex Marquardt is joining us. Alex, there are fears that what Giuliani is now pushing here in the United States could actually be part of Russia's latest and very massive disinformation campaign in the U.S. presidential election.
Massive indeed, Wolf. We do know that it's a very active Russian campaign. That's according to the U.S. intelligence community.
Do you hear what he just said there? We know that it is a Russian disinformation campaign. That's according to the U.S. intelligence community. So in the mind of this CNN propagandist, when the U.S. intelligence community says something, namely this is a Russian disinformation campaign, in his mind, we know it's true. That's what he just said. Let's just play that again.
Serious questions tonight about whether the Russians are using Rudy Giuliani to interfere in the U.S. presidential election. CNN senior national security correspondent Alex Marquardt is joining us. Alex, there are fears that what Giuliani is now pushing here in the United States could actually be part of Russia's latest and very massive disinformation campaign in the U.S. presidential election.
Massive indeed, Wolf. We do know that it's a very active Russian campaign. That's according to the U.S. intelligence community, and that Rudy Giuliani already had open contact with a person that the U.S. has called an agent for the Kremlin. Now, we are being told by two people who've been briefed on what the FBI is doing, that they're looking into whether these unverified emails about Hunter Biden that were published earlier this week by the New York Post about his business dealings in Ukraine and China are part of this bigger Russian disinformation effort in the 2020 election. Now, those efforts, according to the intelligence community, are to denigrate the Biden campaign and the former vice president in favor of President Trump. The New York Post says that...
Okay, look at the irony there. First of all, do you notice that none of these reports will even mention or tell their viewers about the substance of the reporting, what they actually reveal about what Joe Biden and his family did? They just gloss right over that. They don't want their viewers to know. They want millions of people to go to the ballot box without having any idea what this reporting revealed. But what's even more ironic is they keep claiming that the archive itself is unverified when they're spreading disinformation all over the place. They keep repeating over and over that this is Russian disinformation, even though they have no idea that it's true. And as we know now from this new book, and even from many months before from reporting, they're the ones who are lying. They were the ones spreading disinformation. They were the ones saying things that had no verification, namely that this was an archive that came from Russia and was disinformation. Look at this thing here, this trash here, that's almost amusing if it weren't so disgusting. It's from the Huffington Post on October 20th, so less than a week after the New York Post started its reporting. It's masquerading as a news article, but it's obviously a campaign video for Joe Biden. And look at what the Huffington Post says. It's a center-left magazine or newspaper or website or whatever the hell it is, and it produced a video that does nothing but treat unverified claims from the CIA as true. Look at the video that they produced under news. Look at the dramatic music, the American flag waving, the ominous tones and undercurrents. This was all lies. Every word in this video was an absolute lie. From the Huffington Post, from Wolf Blitzer, from Christiane Amanpour, from Leslie Stahl. They had no basis whatsoever for saying any of it. It just, like I said, I have so many examples. Here's how PBS reported on this story on October 16th.
Over the past few days, President Trump has highlighted a report by the New York Post about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. There are major questions about the origins and the accuracy of that story. And today, we learn more about concerns expressed by the president's most senior advisors, that the president's personal attorney was peddling Russian disinformation. To talk about all of this,
over and over, Russian disinformation, misinformation, never even discussing or alluding to the substance of the revelations because they're desperate not to do anything to harm Joe Biden's chances. Instead, they just lied over and over. Here's an op-ed from the Washington Post that really captures just how low and dirty they are and how much they were willing to lie. It's an op-ed from the Washington Post on October 24th by Thomas Rid, one of the leading Russiagators, a computer science expert, under the headline, insisting that Hunter Biden laptop is fake is a trap. Listen to this paragraph that he wrote. Take a step back, and the Russian interference of 2016 holds valuable lessons on what to do and what not to do in 2020. We must treat the Hunter Biden leaks as if they were a foreign intelligence operation, even if they probably aren't. He's kind of giving up the game. He's saying, we learned from 2016 that we can't allow damaging leaks to the Democratic Party to spread throughout the media. So even though it's probably not the case that this is Russian disinformation, let's treat it as though it is. Now, as I alluded to earlier, I have a personal stake in this story because I founded a media outlet in 2013 called The Intercept, the purpose of which was to be adversarial to the CIA. At the time, I had the most significant story I was reporting at The Guardian, one of the oldest and most respected newspapers in the West. I could have stayed there forever, but I left because I wanted to found a news outlet that did journalism and reporting differently, that was skeptical of the CIA and its claims, and investigated what they had to say rather than mindlessly treating it as truth, and that did reporting differently than how the New York Times did it. And yet I'm extremely ashamed to say that added to the pile of lies told by the corporate media in the run-up to the election was this media outlet that I founded, The Intercept, which also repeated the CIA's lies in telling people to ignore this reporting. And it was done, notably, by a former reporter from the New York Times that the editor-in-chief of The Intercept, who wasn't there at the founding, Betsy Reed, hired because she was eager to turn The Intercept into the New York Times and succeeded in doing so. So here's the article from The Intercept. On October 21st, when all the other media outlets that we were supposed to be different than were saying the same things, they published this article by a former New York Times reporter, Jim Risen, titled, "We're Not a Democracy. 4 years ago, the nation tumbled down the Trump rabbit hole. We've been lost in the dark so long, it's hard to know which way is up." Just standard anti-Trump agitprop, the same thing you get from CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, Vox, Vice, Huffington Post, every single day, nothing different. But this was one of the most incriminating paragraphs I've ever seen The Intercept publish and was a major cause of why I left. They just mindlessly repeated the CIA's lie when telling people to ignore the Hunter Biden story. This paragraph begins by saying, the Trump movement's latest falsehood once again involves Biden, Ukraine, and a laptop mysteriously discovered in a computer repair shop and passed to the New York Post thanks to Trump crony Rudy Giuliani. Jim Risen and The Intercept had no idea whether that was a false story or not. And they didn't care. They said it was false because they were in campaign operative mode, where they were eager to ensure that Joe Biden wasn't hurt in any way, and therefore were willing to lie for him in the Democratic Party by labeling a story that was true as false. And then he went on to say, this week, a group of former intelligence officials issued a letter saying that the Giuliani laptop story has the classic trademarks of Russian disinformation. This is a media outlet I created 7 years earlier to be adversarial to the intelligence community. And then 7 years later, they have New York Times reporters on staff uncritically disseminating what the intelligence community is saying in order to help the Democratic Party. And notice that even those intelligence officials were more honest than The Intercept, because in their letter, they noted they had no evidence for believing it's true. And The Intercept, when quoting it, omitted that rather crucial part. Now, I'm going to get back to The Intercept in a moment because it's a microcosm of what the corporate media did in this extraordinary deceit and the brute censorship of our political discourse based on the lies told by them and their intelligence community partners. But first, I just want to reveal what happened in the aftermath of Twitter and Facebook's extraordinary decision to censor the internet to protect Joe Biden. Twitter, to their credit at least, apologized and changed their policy. On October 16th, the Washington Post headline read, Twitter changes policy, that blocked a New York Post story about Biden's son. CNBC that same day reported that Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey says blocking New York Post story was, quote, wrong. And Jack Dorsey himself went onto Twitter and essentially admitted error by saying, quote, straight blocking of the URLs was wrong, and we updated our policy and enforcement to fix. Our goal is to attempt to add context, and now we have the capabilities to do that. They didn't allow the New York Post back into their account until 2 weeks later, but at least they acknowledged wrongdoing. Facebook, to this very day, has never acknowledged any wrongdoing at all in suppressing what was a true story and interfering in our election. And not only that, remember, the Democratic Party operative, Andy Stone, who made the announcement on behalf of Facebook, told an outright lie. He said, oh, look, we're just algorithmically suppressing the story pending a fact check by ourselves and our partners to make sure the documents are real. Where is that fact check from Facebook? It never came. You know why? Because the documents were real, and a fact check would have revealed that. They knew at the time the documents were real. They never did any fact check. They never released any fact check because that would have revealed that they censored true information. And I've privately and publicly called on Facebook to answer questions about what they did. Here is a DM I sent to Andy Stone, and I've also sent them similar private email inquiries back in April asking him, did you in fact do the fact check that you promised when announcing the censorship? And if so, what did it reveal? And you can see here, he didn't answer me. He's never answered me, nor has any Facebook official ever addressed these questions of why it is that they suppressed a true story and claimed that they were conducting a fact check that they never actually released to the public. Now, one of the crucial parts to realize about this did not just emerge suddenly, like as a panic move, when the New York Post published this incriminating reporting. They had been planning for this for a long time. In fact, for years, the corporate media was open about the fact that they didn't want to make what they considered to be the same mistake they made in 2016, namely reporting. They believe that their reporting on the documents published by WikiLeaks about Hillary Clinton helped elect Donald Trump and harm Hillary Clinton, and they decided our job is not to do reporting. We should not report negatively on the Democratic Party candidate. We made a mistake in doing that. We just thought Hillary was going to win anyway, and that's why we did it. I had conversations the night that Trump was elected and Hillary was defeated where people at The Intercept came and said, we should apologize for the reporting that we did on the DNC archive that WikiLeaks published because that helped defeat Hillary. That's what they became convinced was their job, not to do reporting, but to avoid reporting and help the Democratic Party. And they spent 2 years planning how they would not report on information if it emerged in the leading up to the election for Donald Trump's reelection if it reflected poorly on the Democratic Party. Here's an article from February of 2020, so the beginning of the campaign year, from the New York Times. It reads, lawmakers are warned that Russia is meddling to re-elect Trump. A classified briefing to House members is said to have angered the president, who complained that Democrats would weaponize the disclosure. The article went on to say, quote, intelligence officials warned House lawmakers last week that Russia was interfering in the 2020 campaign to try and get President Trump reelected. 5 people with the matter said. A disclosure to Congress that angered Mr. Trump, who complained that Democrats would use it against him. It went on. And then here is the Washington Post on October 14th. So the day of the New York Post reporting saying here's our new policy regarding hacked or leaked material during the final weeks of an election season. Be careful what is in your social media feeds. This is Glenn Kessler, the fact checker for the Washington Post, warning people on the day the New York Post report emerged to, quote, be careful what is in your social media feeds, obviously implying that the New York Post story was misinformation. What was a lie was what Glenn Kessler was implying. And note that the Washington Post rewrote their policy about how to report hacked or leaked material in the final weeks of an election to avoid what they did in 2016, which was do real reporting. And the argument was that if Russia, quote, interferes in our election again by releasing true and accurate information that might hurt the Democratic Party, like they did in 2016, according to the media, they should basically rewrite rules to allow them not to report on it, to be careful, to weigh context. Now, obviously, if some anti-Trump country had hacked into the Trump campaign and obtained documents to reveal serious corruption by the Trump campaign or Donald Trump, if, say, Iran or Venezuela or China or Palestine had used hackers to obtain incriminating dirt on Trump through hacking, obviously the New York Times and the Washington Post and every other media outlet would publish it. They wouldn't care that it came from a foreign power or that it was done by virtue of hacking. They would say what journalists have always said and what I say and still agree with, which is, as a journalist, you don't care where accurate material comes from. You don't care what the motive of the source is. You don't care why the source is giving you accurate information. The only two questions as a journalist that you should ask are, number one, is this information accurate? And number two, is in the public interest to know. That's the foundation of journalism, that inquiry. And if the answers to those questions are yes, the information is accurate and it's in the public interest to know, you publish it no matter what. They rewrote their guidelines to justify letting them not publish information that's accurate if it came late in the campaign and might have helped Joe Biden win because it was information that would have reflected poorly on him. And just to show you what an absolute corruption of the journalistic function this is, let's just look at a similar episode from 2016. As you might recall, the New York Times in October of 2016, so the month before the election, got hold of Donald Trump's tax returns, and they reported it, as they should have. Donald Trump tax records show he could have avoided taxes for nearly 2 decades, the Times found. Now, you know what's so interesting about that story? The New York Times, to this day, has no idea who sent them these documents. They don't know who the source was, and therefore, obviously, they don't know what motive the person had. It could have been a Russian, it could have been a hacker, could have been someone who stole it. It could have been someone who bribed the accountant. They didn't care. They published it anyway, because that's what journalists do. Here's what the New York Times article said, quote, the tax documents consisted of 3 pages from what appeared to be Mr. Trump's 1995 tax returns. The pages were mailed last month to Susan Craig, a reporter at the Times who has written about Mr. Trump's finances. The 3 documents arrived by mail at the Times with the postmark indicating they had been sent from New York City. Their return address claimed the envelope had been sent from Trump Tower. Someone dropped it in the mail anonymously, and they ran with the story. Why? Because they authenticated it, and it was in the public interest. They didn't care whether it came from the Russians. They don't know if it did. Now, here is them justifying it. They were asked, how can you publish documents in 2016 that you don't know the origins of, that you don't know the provenance of? Here is Michael Barbaro, the host of the highly popular New York Times podcast, The Daily, who is citing his colleague David Barstow, who's a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, was the lead reporter on that story about Trump's tax returns. And he wrote here in the tweet, this is why New York Times David Barstow does not care who leaked us Trump's tax returns or what the motivation was. This has always been the predominant journalistic ethos until 2020 when they rewrote the rules to protect Biden. We don't care how our source got the documents. We don't care who they are, and we don't care why they're leaking to us. All we care about is it true, and does the public have a right to know? Listen to David Barstow, the New York Times reporter, justifying why they reported on these documents, even though they don't know who sent it to them.
You know, it's funny. People often, when there are conversations about whistleblowers, the conversation's often framed around, did they have noble intentions, or did they have some, was it score settling or some less than noble motive? From the years of doing this, I've found that sometimes whistleblowers with terrible motives come forward with incredible documents, and I've also had times when whistleblowers with just the most perfect, pristine motives come forward and the documents are worthless. What really matters to me is this information real? And if so, is it newsworthy? One of the most important whistleblowers in American history is a man named Merrill Williams. He worked for the tobacco industry. The first time I met him many years ago, his first words to me, I remember, were, I'm a born liar. This was a man with multiple marriages, bankruptcy. He was a drunk. He was this. But what he was also was he was a paralegal at Brown & Williamson. And his job was to go through tobacco industry documents and filter out documents that might be handed over in litigation that would get the tobacco industry in trouble. And instead what he did is every day when he found really bad documents, he'd stuff them into a rubber girdle and he would take them out on his lunch break and he would go to a Kinko's, he'd make copies, and ultimately he amassed the largest trove of internal tobacco industry documents. His motives were as bad as they get. He wanted to cash in, he wanted money. His documents changed the history of smoking in America.
That's journalism. You don't care about the source or their motives. You only care about the documents. That was always how journalism functioned until 2018 and 2019, when they wanted to make sure that they had an excuse to avoid reporting on documents that they were told were hacked by Russia. So that was why the CIA made up this lie. Oh, this Hunter Biden archive, it's disinformation from Russia, because they knew these media outlets had spent 2 years laying the foundation to ignore the story. So the lie that the CIA told fit perfectly with how they corruptly rewrote the rules of journalism to protect Joe Biden. Now, as I alluded to before, I wanted to report on the Hunter Biden documents when I was at The Intercept, and I was stopped from doing so. And I had a huge war over the course of 10 days with my Biden-supporting editors who didn't want me to report on it, even though, while telling me that they have very high editorial standards at The Intercept, and therefore my article has to go through very rigorous fact-checking, they had just the week before published this outright lie from Jim Risen, the New York Times reporter, based on the CIA's claim that the Hunter Biden archive was Russian disinformation. So I was listening to editors who had just published a CIA lie to protect Joe Biden, telling me that I couldn't report on this story because I couldn't meet their high-level editorial standards. The news outlet I founded. And 2 days before I quit The Intercept over the censorship, but while I was in the midst of not just fighting with them, but seeing this incredible lying going on the part of the media and the censorship on the part of Twitter and Facebook of what I knew were authentic documents, I went on the Joe Rogan show and I explained to Joe Rogan exactly what was going on. This is what I said. This is what I had been observing firsthand from within the media at the time all of this was happening. This is why I don't think I've ever been as disgusted with my colleagues in my profession as I have been the last 3 weeks because of this story, and I'll tell you why. In general, journalists do not care about where material comes from if it's A, authentic, and B, newsworthy. So this idea that journalists are using, like, oh my God, this might have come from Russia, therefore we shouldn't report it, is a complete corruption of the journalistic function. But the reality, Joe, like, why are we even talking about this? Like, everyone knows the reality. I work in journalism. I have, lots of colleagues that I work with. I have tons of friends in every news outlet up and down the East Coast, from New York to Washington and then on the West Coast. The reason is because they're all desperate for Trump to lose. That's the reality. They all want Biden to win. And so they don't want to report any information or any stories that might help Biden lose, in part because they want Biden to win, but also because in their social circles, everybody essentially is anti-Trump and pro-Biden. And they don't want to spend 4 years being accused of having helped Trump win like they were in 2016 when they reported on those emails that were leaked by the WikiLeaks. And it's just fear. They don't want to be yelled at. They don't want to be scorned in their social circles. And so they're willing to abdicate their journalistic function, which is reporting on one of the most powerful people in the world, in Joe Biden, in part because they want to manipulate and tinker with the election using journalism, but in much bigger part because they're scared of being yelled at on Twitter. It's fucking pathetic. And it's going to ruin people's faith in journalism for a long time, even more so than it already is ruined, for good reason. I now defend people who say fake news, as you were saying, even though in 2016 I didn't like it either, because it's just true. It's just true. They will lie. They will print things that they have no idea whether or not they're true if the CIA tells them to, or if they think they can get attention from it for it, or applause from their colleagues on Twitter. And I don't blame, if you have faith in mainstream news institutions, you're really irrational. Now, I believe all of that even more than ever. At that time, it was frustrating, in part because I knew that this Hunter Biden archive was authentic, but because the evidence was presented by right-wing media outlets who people are trained to ignore, the huge numbers of liberals didn't even know that evidence existed. And so it was impossible to get them to believe. They had been lied to and told that this was Russian disinformation, and they believed it. But I was also obviously talking about the conflict I had personally with my own editors inside the media outlet I had created, but I wasn't yet prepared to talk about it publicly because I hadn't concluded that I had to quit because I thought maybe they would still publish my article. But you could see there that that's what I was talking about. So I just want to quickly explain to you what I saw firsthand from the Intercept, in trying to report the story in light of this new reporting that these documents are authentic, because I think you'll see how deeply corrupt they became as the election approached, how fearful and corrupt and dishonest they became, desperate not to do anything that could be seen as helping Donald Trump win, even if it meant they were just doing their jobs. Now, my relationship with The Intercept and with every news outlet I had ever worked at previously, The Guardian and Salon, was that my work isn't edited by anybody unless I specifically requested. I had started off in 2005 as a blogger. I would open my blog page. I would say and type what I wanted to say, put it to the internet, and I was never willing to have any editors tell me what I could and couldn't say and have to fight with them for the right to say it. And written into my contract with every media outlet was a clause that said I have the right to directly post to the internet without editorial interference unless I specifically request an editor. The Intercept, like every other media outlet, including The Guardian and Salon, always honored that until the week before the 2020 election, when they learned that I wanted to write a story about Hunter Biden. And I didn't want, and the documents, and I didn't want editorial supervision because I knew that they had just published a lie about this archive saying it was Russian disinformation and would try and stop me from writing anything that might, in the eyes of their friends, be seen as reflecting poorly on Joe Biden. And yet, despite that contract and that practice that had served me very well over the course of my 15-year career, the editor-in-chief of The Intercept, Betsy Reed, a hardcore liberal who wasn't there at the founding but has kind of taken over, she wrote me a message in Slack when she heard that I was writing about these documents, telling me that we were going to deviate from the practice we had done for 7 years, and that this time I wouldn't be able to publish my article directly to the internet, that they would have to go through a team of editors, her and her friends, to get approval before it could be published. And this is how she justified it in a Slack message to me. She wrote, quote, "This is a piece of some significance, which is likely to elicit a great deal of scrutiny. So we need to go through the editorial process and fact-checking that we apply to any story with this kind of high profile." She went on, "We also have a lot of in-house knowledge about Ukraine that we should tap into via Jim Risen, a former New York Times reporter, who was also working on a story related to this, and Rob Mackey, another New York Times journalist, telling me that I basically had to go through 2 New York Times journalists to get published on an outlet that was created to be the anti-New York Times. She said, "I get that you have disagreements with them, but we should be able to agree on a common set of facts." And in reply, I explained to her that I knew exactly what was really going on. I wrote, quote, "This is really what is going on. If someone at The Intercept wants to say something consistent with the prevailing liberal narrative or designed to help Biden win," which is the same thing, There are no editorial standards of any kind that are applied. They're free to say whatever they want, even if it's false. That's why Ryzen was able to publish a story today claiming over and over that the New York Post emails are Russian disinformation, even though everyone knows there's no proof of that. But liberals like it, and it helps Biden, so it's good to go. That's exactly what was happening. The idea that The Intercept has high editorial standards was a complete joke. Telling me that I had to meet their editorial rigor before I could publish, I knew it was a joke. There are no editorial standards as long as you feed liberals what they want, which is why Jim Rising got to publish that lie. Editorial standards only kick in if you want to do something that liberals will dislike, like reporting on the Hunter Biden documents and what they reflected about Joe Biden. Now, here's the article that I'm talking about, the high editorial standards of The Intercept that they had published that day or just a couple days before. Quote, this week, a group of former intelligence officials issued a letter saying the Giuliani laptop story has the classic trademarks of Russian disinformation. Does that sound to you like a news outlet that has high editorial standards? Or does that sound like a news outlet, like all the other ones, willing to say anything to help Joe Biden win? And what was so amazing to me about this episode was being told that I had to get the approval of two reporters, Jim Risen and Robert Mackey. Who are they? Here's Robert Mackey's bio page, and you can see there he says, before joining The Intercept as a senior writer, he was a reporter and columnist for the New York Times. And the other one I had to get the approval of, Jim Risen, quote, is a best-selling author and former New York Times reporter. It is now The Intercept senior national security correspondent based in Washington, D.C. I was being told that to be able to speak about the election, I had to first get the approval of two New York Times reporters. And they weren't just any two New York Times reporters. They had proven themselves. The reason they were hired is because they were hardcore resistance liberals, over and over publishing the same garbage that was available on every other site, from CNN to Vox to Vice to Vulture to MSNBC. That every article they wrote came right out of Rachel Maddow's voice. This is who I had to get past in order to get published. Just to give you a few examples, here's an article from Jim Risen in 2018, subtly entitled, Is Donald Trump a Traitor? And you'll be shocked to learn that his answer was yes. Here's another article from him. William Barr has turned the Justice Department into a law firm with one client, Donald Trump. Here's another one from him. Donald Trump unleashed his cult on American democracy. And then here's a few articles illustrative from Robert Mackey. Trump unleashes mob to storm Capitol and disrupt functioning of U.S. government. Trump made a racist joke in a Phoenix megachurch and the crowd went wild. White House plants pro-Trump conspiracy theorists among reporters in briefing rooms. Over and over. This is the kind of reporting that The Intercept did, as well as virtually every other corporate outlet. They just turned themselves into DNC propaganda arms, which is why they were willing to lie on behalf of the CIA and Joe Biden and say that these documents that we now know are authentic were Russian disinformation. And just to give you a little feel for how foundational to The Intercept's founding was being antithetical and adversarial to the New York Times rather than subservient to it, which ended up being my position when I wanted to report on the 2020 election. In 2013, when I announced the founding of The Intercept, I had an email exchange with the executive editor at the time in the New York Times, Bill Keller, under this title where he published our very acrimonious exchange about what The Intercept was going to be. And he very kind of ominously wrote, is Glenn Greenwald the future of news? And here is what he wrote before the exchange. Glenn Greenwald broke what is probably the year's biggest story, Edward Snowden's revelations of the vast surveillance apparatus constructed by the NSA. He has also been an outspoken critic of the kind of journalism practiced at places like the New York Times. It then goes on to say, earlier this month, he announced he was joining a new journalistic venture backed by eBay billionaire Pierre Omidyar, and who has promised to invest $250 million and, quote, throw out all the rules. So that was the whole purpose of The Intercept, was to be contrary to the New York Times and to do journalism differently. And yet all of the media was so desperate to elect Joe Biden, defeat Donald Trump, that they ended up all turning themselves into the New York Times, putting 2 New York Times reporters above me. I had to get past them and get their approval, these resistance liberals, in order to do my reporting. And the entire media ecosystem turned into outlets that reported things like this, that the CIA said that this archive was Russian disinformation, and therefore it should be ignored. Now, today is a really significant day because of this new book. It's true that conservative outlets already offered the proof that should have been enough to show everyone that it was authentic, these documents that raise serious questions about Joe Biden, but a lot of people wouldn't believe it until it came from a place like Politico. This is a young reporter from Politico who published this reporting, and he deserves credit for telling people what liberal journalists don't want to hear. That can be very dangerous when you're starting off your profession. But the reporting he did is very important, because what it reveals is not so much that these documents were authentic all along. It reveals what a grave assault on journalism and our democracy took place before the 2020 election. There's obviously been very severe acts of censorship that I regard as very dangerous. Kicking Donald Trump off Twitter and Facebook and every other social media platform. Having Parler destroyed when it was the #1 most popular and downloaded app in the country because Democratic politicians like Ro Khanna and AOC demanded it. And so the tech monopolies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon united to destroy Parler. Those are all really grave. But I regard this censorship by Twitter and Facebook, this censorship of this very genuine and important reporting in the weeks before the election, as the gravest assault of them all, because it was designed to manipulate the outcome of an election. And it was accomplished by having journalists lie over and over and justify not reporting on very consequential documents by simply rewriting the rules of journalism, mindlessly depending on the CIA, and just engaging in groupthink of a type that we never saw before. And as a result, we will never know whether the outcome of the 2020 election was altered by millions and millions of people being denied the right to have heard this accurate reporting, denied by a union of big tech, the CIA, corporate media outlets, and the Democratic Party. And when you look at it from start to finish, I think you can really see how much fraud and how much deceit and how much planning on the part of so many power centers went into this in a way that so fundamentally corrupts journalists and journalism, that if you don't harbor contempt for the media outlets who did this, I do think you're being irrational. And however much contempt you do harbor for them after all this, in my view, is not enough.